everybody for being here. I know this is an afternoon session. It is indeed my pleasure and privilege to chair this special session of the Future Summit organization, organized by Nutshell and its sponsors. Akhtar just does it all the time, and he's done it again. I have to say this is going to be very different from the topic of the theme of this. The only thing that would be common between this platform and our speakers will be the way forward and focus on solutions. As you all know, Pakistan is not new to economic crisis. They surface more acutely in the process and in midst of the political transition. And it's a loaded statement, and I'm sure you can interpret why it happens. What is different this time? While the epicenter of the crisis is external vulnerabilities, the context, breadth, and depth of domestic crisis and its various dimensions is phenomenal. The level of FX reserves and its fall in 2022 is worrisome. Inflation is at historic highs. The productive sectors have been jolted by shocks resulting in layoffs. Economic and social gains have rolled back, and PSX market capitalization is at its lowest. Policy reversals and unpredictability compounds policy uncertainty and have eroded the confidence. So what happened? Before we get into the questions with our colleagues here, unprecedented monetary stimulus to avert pandemic-induced economic contraction. The objective was revival of growth in 2021. It indeed happened, but look at the cost of that later on because of the massive refinancing put in the wrong pockets. 2, growth has faltered thereafter in the wake of frequent political and economic disruptions. There has been a persistent neglect over the years and decades of productivity and competitiveness. Age-old structural distortions are pervasive across sectors that need immediate surgery. Pakistan's climate vulnerabilities are now haunting us, and they have manifested themselves in 2022 devastating floods. I can tell you within Sindh province, people are still sitting outside by the side of the floods. To date, no sustainable housing has come forward despite all the calls for the aid. There has been growing debt burden, both domestic and external, with reserves depleting. And I'm not going to give you figures because they are all over the place. And this is largely because of policy reversals and uncertainty, and FX payments have exceeded our FX earning capacity for some time. So challenges abound, but let's count on our distinguished panel to go beyond the diagnostics, which I have kept very brief to set the scene, to focus on progressive and sustainable development and finance solutions. Crisis prevention, its risk management, and its risk mitigation ought to be our top priority, and that's what our panelists will focus on. We need to build fiscal and reserve buffers backed by a well thought out, in my view, debt profiling or restructuring, which some people think is not the right way to go, but it is indeed the right way to go. And we have to stop playing the musical chair of passing the parcel of new borrowings to settle due repayments and claiming our debt to be sustainable. And I do hope that our partners in development would recognize the unsustainability of the debt and developments of the balance of payment. The questions framed to our panelists are within these broad contours. So our panelists have been introduced, but Najy, who is the World Bank's country director for Pakistan, has been very kind to accept my invitation. Before he served anything else, he and I worked in the MENA region together, very fond memories with him. And I have to tell you that Morocco is one place where he was the senior economist, and I obviously was vice president of Middle East and North Africa, which you just heard. And there was a fascinating program of human capital. And of course, we worked together jointly on MENA development strategy, which was post-Arab Spring. So I have few questions from him, hoping that at some time we will also have Pakistan Spring, and we will be celebrating together like we did the Arab Spring together. So my first question is, can you offer some perspectives on how things change post-Arab Spring for North Africa, where everybody thought all hell had broken? As we witness the fast tracking now of the industrial and export diversification that has given a lead to Morocco as a hub, and it's even exporting automobile from there. And let me pose the second question, that you have just released a country economic memorandum. I used to author them when I was at the office, your office there, almost for a decade. So I recognize the value proposition of the policy advice that used to be packaged in these country economic memorandums. So we value your offering recommendations on how to navigate out of human capital crisis, low domestic resource mobilization, trap, external vulnerabilities, which I just talked about, and particularly your thought process on how can we improve productivity, export-based expansions, which are critical for the reserve buildup. And this theme will cut across all our panelists with special focus on certain items so that we cover the entire gamut of the issues that I have laid out. Okay, so over to you, Najy, to lead the dialogue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shamshad. Salam alaikum. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. Very well organized. I'd like to thank the organizers. So I'll say a few words about Morocco. More broadly, the Arab Spring and the 2011, I mean, there's many lessons on them. But one of them, unfortunately, and that doesn't apply to Morocco, is that the countries that had rents of all sorts before the Arab Spring, be it oil rents, be it geopolitical rents, the incentives to reform did not change. And that's something to keep in mind. Rents, be they oil rents or other or geopolitical rents, when they're there and when there's it can sustain a poor equilibrium in terms of policy. I want to say this at the outset in general across the Middle East and North Africa region, because we don't have that many examples of sustained growth acceleration. Interestingly, for Morocco, the Arab Spring made no difference, because Morocco, and there's a few lessons from Morocco, started its diversification in exports before the Arab Spring, actually in the early 2000s. Younger generation of leaders, younger generation of bureaucrats, new blood in the bureaucracy, in the high-level bureaucracy, basically, and the realization that they cannot go on with structural twin deficits, which is a topic that Pakistan is very familiar with. There was pressure from the youth, urbanizing youth, high unemployment, and systemic fiscal deficit and current account deficits. And there was this moment of realization that they needed to do something about it. And it's interesting because in many countries around the world where we've observed sustained growth accelerations and moments where countries realize they need to reform, it's often driven by triggered by a crisis, often a macro crisis, or some kind of change. And this is what happened in Morocco. So I work in development, and I also have shared memories of working with you, Dr. Shamshad. But when you work in development, you have to be optimistic. And when I see the macroeconomic difficulties that Pakistan face, as many other countries have faced before, and I realize that these type of crises, not always, but sometimes in the history of nations were turning points, it makes me optimistic. That's for the easy part. Now, I'll come to your question that's Pakistan specific, but on Morocco, I'd like to say a few words, because indeed, they have been able to diversify their exports. But to start with, they had the basics right. They had macroeconomic stability, they had trade openness, and an anchor to this openness to trade and foreign investment, which was this agreement with the EU. And that was a very strong anchor. Morocco is a few kilometers away from Spain, and that anchor with the EU was ensured that they had an external anchor to make sure their trade regime was open, which is not the case for Pakistan, and that was a prerequisite. At the same time, there was huge pressure. China had joined WTO, so traditional exports of Morocco, textile, a bit of garments, were under threat, so there was economic threats coming from outside. And huge pressure from the population, as I said, because of high unemployment. So that's the starting point.
And Najy, if I may just add one thing which you may recall, which was very path-breaking in Morocco, was the negotiation around the concentrated solar power, where IFC and IBRD both invested together. And this is Tunisia also involved in it, where there was, long time back, this discussion of trading renewable energy to Europe.
So what they absolutely, and in fact what they did is to think through sectoral strategies, some of them in solar, automobile, aeronautics, electronics, and thinking back, some people, there's a lot of doubts because these industrial strategies have failed in many countries. But when you look at what Morocco did, there was not much subsidies in these. They were all anchored in export targets. They were all anchored in no regret strategic infrastructure investments, like the port of Tangiers in the north next to Spain. They were all anchored in continuity in the teams that thought through these visions and these sectoral strategies. Very few subsidies. No power subsidies, no blanket subsidies, no protection, targets on exports. These sound familiar. Targets on exports sounds like East Asia. So I don't think Morocco reinvented the wheel. So let me stop here. I think these few lessons, sectoral visions, no blanket subsidies, pragmatism, export targets, no regrets infrastructure investments, in parallel investments in education and health, they had a lot to catch up on, and continuity in policies. Governments changed since they started in the early 2000s, and they changed quite a bit, but no one re-questioned the sectoral strategy that was started, because these things don't happen overnight. So the automobile strategy of Morocco today has adjusted. It's about the same as the draft I had read in 2008. And this continuity was critical. Did that solve everything? No. It had impact on exports, impact on diversification. Employment and growth did not pick up so much. So, I don't want to paint a too rosy picture of Morocco because it still have challenges, and the the authorities are, of course, aware of that. Let me stop here on Morocco. Do you want me to come on Pakistan now, or maybe we should move across? As you want.
We can come back to it.
Very good.
So that we have a diversity of
Yep.
thought process. I will, in any case, state all the questions to each of the panelists, but give time to Maroof to address whatever he can. And then if you want to join, but let me go one round with each panelist first. Okay? So, Maroof Sahib, it's a real pleasure to get to know you through this platform, and we've had some very good discussion over the last 2 days to frame what we could cover in sync with the issues that Pakistan faces. From being a self-sufficient country in food, Pakistan has now for years been relying on importing agriculture products. In this context, agriculture productivity, given our growing population, is critical for the way forward. What technologies and intervention can yield immediate dividends? And I'm speaking in forward-looking context.
Thank you. First of all, great conference. Thank you, Asfar, for inviting. And really excited in terms of the conversations I've had already. Shamshad Sahib, I think I'm really glad that you started with a truth serum, right? Because sometimes in our optimism and exuberance of the future, we forget that whatever future we build, it should be tied to the problems that we have. And so identifying those problems is super critical. And so when we talk about agri-productivity, of course, everybody knows that, it's agri sector is 19% of GDP, it's 40% of the labor force. But the fact is that it has stagnated for a long time. And you mentioned on the fact that, food insecurity, Farooq Amin Saab also mentioned that if we increase our yields, it can have lots of really good dividends. Now, the fact is that how do you do that, right? And how do you increase domestic productivity? Because we know growth is very much tied to domestic productivity gains. So let me sort of break it down into 3 layers. One is the interventions that are possible, the technologies that are leverageable, but also, and of course the results, right? Because we want to measure things. But the third critical piece is the process. Because a lot of times we can lead with solutions, and it can quickly become sort of peddling a solution, which is not tied to the problem that you're trying to solve. So the process is going to be really important. And I'm going to illustrate this with an example. So at CERP, and this would be a good example because this actually involved academic institutions, it involved us, CERP, but also a private sector player, since we have so many private sector represented here. So this project that we did was with HBL, so Habib Bank, CERP, Princeton University, and Yale University did this together. And we looked at what are the main problems that afflict us in terms of agri-productivity. So of course, the production inefficiencies, inadequate access to markets, and lack of financing. These are like 3 very critical pieces to the problem. And we devised an intervention that leveraged technology, but it was centered around this problem. So of course, it started with connecting farmers to markets or to high quality inputs or mechanized services. It involved connecting farmers to downstream markets. It also involved providing financing and taking out some of the extractive players in the process, right? And basically providing advisory services to these farmers, but also constantly measuring, right? So having a baseline, what is the state of the world, and then moving forward in terms of, so let me state some results. It yielded 22% increase in maize crop yield. So it started with maize crop in Okada, We're talking about 3,200 acres, and we're talking about a 22% increase in yield. Not only that, it increased 28% top line for these HBL farmers, I'm going to call them. And then, it also resulted in sort of a 22% decrease in price that the HBL clients were paying to these farmers. But interestingly, in terms of their income, earned 117% more income of these particular farmers compared to an average farmer in Punjab, right? But it had also ancillary benefits. It had ancillary benefits like financial inclusion. It increased use of debit card from 52% to 75% on average. And then on monthly basis, it went from 9% to 21%. Now what I'm saying is, now I'll come to the process, because the process is really important. We're measuring all these things, right? So how are we doing this? A lot of interesting data that we're doing digital survey. We're also looking at HBL's admin data, but we also leveraged and we pioneered satellite imagery at this scale in Pakistan. So we looked at real-time, soil data, real-time crop yield data, and merged it to analyze what's going on. How can we increase yield from a lot to lot, acre to acre basis? Not just saying that we'll, digitize this path, but of course that matters, but also what are the clear interventions that solve real problems and create that yield at a system level.
So Maroof Sahab, while I have you still, let me ask you a related question from the agriculture sector. How does land tax, which I'm disappointed is not a part of this mini budget, address perverse incentives in the system? How does it divert capital investments from unproductive asset class, such as real estate, into productive assets? So how do we go about it?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because we've been talking about it, and the mini budget is out, and we seem to always have sacred cows in Pakistan, right? We don't want to touch the real hard stuff sometimes. And I think as we think about the future, as we build it, we have to go for the hard stuff. Without it, there is no pathway to development. We have to take things by the horns, if you will. And land tax is a very, very important topic, right? And several economists have talked about it. But let me sort of say that, Najy talked about rent, and we have a lot of perverse incentives in the country, right? I mean, I'll mix land and agri, but we have the 5th largest cultivated land in the world on sugarcane. And we provide subsidy, right? We all understand the political economy around it, but let's not talk about that right now. It's really important to understand that what do those subsidies create? They create perverse incentives, right? Sometimes. And especially subsidies that go into perpetuity. वो कभी खत्म ही नहीं होंगे, right? So land tax is very, very fundamental. So nations rise because productivity improves in a country, right? So if we want to rise, we have to really think about our priorities. Not for the IMF or some other multilateral to come, squeeze our arms or twist our arms and say, yaar, aapne ye karna hai. No, we have to own it. We have to understand what are our priorities and why. So land tax is a very, very fundamental thing, because what does it do? You have resources and money, and it flows into real estate. Now, real estate accumulation is a very unproductive use of your money. It's not creating factories, it's not creating auto industry, it's not creating any tech industry for that matter. We talked a lot about digital future here. So I think by putting a tax on land, you're not just raising revenue, which is of course good for the government, but it's also sending a signal to the market that, look, you have to invest in other things. Of course, money wants to make money, right? Capital wants to grow, but it chooses the pathway of making money. So in that terms, you are basically incentivizing, that instead of putting money into real estate, of course I'll put some because I'm diversifying, but instead of putting all my capital in real estate and have an unproductive asset, I'd rather invest in a tech company, or I may invest in a factory or some business and create some productivity gains out of it. So putting that land tax is in our interest. Now, a lot of times this conversation revolves around कि ये बहुत मुश्किल है ये करना, elite, मानेगी नहीं, and sorry, I'm switching between Urdu and English, but I think it's important to understand that this is not, okay, Najy made a point that it's not that Pakistan is unique, that all these development issues that we have, nobody has seen before, right? There are actually models around elite bargaining. So how do you bargain with the elite? Of course, when elite will still make disproportionate benefit out of this change, but it will be a little more equitable. It will actually channel our capital and resources into productive means. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Amjad Waheed Sahab. I think you have talked a lot about national security to be expanded to include economic security, to include food security, energy security, water security, and so forth. I think what would be useful is some reflections on how do you go about doing it. Of course, we have some institutional mechanisms where, we have our National Security Council working with the civil governments. But I haven't seen that working in a much more effective manner. So any ideas you have on that? But also, if I could loop into that, how do we improve the public sector efficiencies in Pakistan, inefficiencies, or efficiencies? There is so much of wasteful expenditure that goes on. There are issues of federal, provincial, which are kind of almost not functioning effectively, land tax being an example, that it is a national important subject, but hence, because it's provincial, we cannot touch it. And also, how do we go about reforming the state-owned enterprise sector, which is a white elephant? I mean, I deal with one of them, and I saw Musaddiq Saab coming in, so hopefully his and my partnership can change that. So over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Shamshad, and I hope you're giving me a couple of hours to respond because what you asked is quite broad. So,
and you have exactly 8 minutes.
So basically, in today's world, national security is a lot more than military security. We need to first of all understand this. And it comprises food security, energy security, climate security, human security. And there are components of human security like education, basic health care, clean drinking water. These are, a basic access to justice system. So these are all elements of human security. So if we look at our own history, I think we have defined national security in a very narrow manner, which basically is military security. And most of the basically funding and efforts have gone towards military security. To some extent, the other areas of security have been ignored. And I mean, for example, education. If we see, out of 50 million children, 24 million children are not going to school at all. And even those who are going to government schools, about 15 million, studies have shown that even a 5th grader cannot write a sentence in Urdu. So only 1 out of 4 children or 1 out of 5 children who are going to private schools are getting some decent level of education. So there's something, what is called expected years of schooling. And the World Bank looks at it, and in Pakistan, the expected years of schooling is 9 years. So out of 149 countries in the world, with GDP of over 10 billion and population of over 1 million, Pakistan is ranked 145th out of 149 countries in expected years of schooling. okay, which is only 9 years. Which are the 4 countries that are below us? Sudan, Mali, Chad, and Niger. So these are the 4 countries that are below us. So even when we talk about the future, because we are not talking about the present literacy level, we are talking about the expected years of schooling, we are 145th in the world. If we look at, the issues are both in terms of how much we have invested in education as a percentage of GDP, and also how effectively we have used that money. These are both, it's an issue of governance, how effectively we are using it, and again, for example, India has spent 2.9% of GDP per year on education. We have spent 1.9%. So had we spent 2.9% like India, we would have spent another $44 billion in education over the last 22 years. Imagine the impact if we had spent another $45 billion over the last 22 years on education to come in line with India. Healthcare, we spend only in the last 22 years, we have spent only 0.7% of GDP on healthcare. India has spent twice as much, 1.3% of GDP. Bangladesh has spent about 4 times that much, about 2.5% of GDP each year for the last 22 years. So in absolute terms, basically in healthcare, India has spent as a percentage of GDP $25 billion more than us, and Bangladesh has spent $78 billion more than us in today's dollar terms. Agriculture. We have only spent 0.14% of GDP on agriculture every year on average over the last 22 years. 0.14%. India has spent India has spent 1.5%. We have spent 0.14%. India spent 1.5% of GDP. So India spent 10 times more on agriculture versus what Pakistan government has spent. And if we talk about Bangladesh, they have spent 7 times more than us on agriculture. So basically the basic agriculture infrastructure where the government needs to come in terms of technology, farm to market roads, providing financing to agriculturists, simply, technology use, so on, we have been lagging behind. And imagine if we had spent another $30–40 billion on agriculture to be on par with India and Bangladesh over the last 22 years, there would have been an agriculture revolution today. So again, population planning, India and Bangladesh have grown at 1.8% per year. We have grown at 2.6% per year. So had we grown at the same rate as India and Bangladesh over the last 50 years, our population would be, instead of 22 crores, it would be 15 crores. 7 crore less people to feed, to educate, to provide housing, to provide jobs. Again, I repeat, if we had spent, our population had grown at the same rate as India and Bangladesh, our population would have been 15 crore rather than 22 crore. So again, an issue where we have not done much. So just to summarize, basically, when you want your economy to grow, there are some inputs. Investment in education is the biggest input. Okay, so for example, if there is a driver or a guard who's earning 30–35,000, if his son is also going to earn 30–35,000, he is not going to demand any more goods and services within his salary. What is economy? It's the value of goods and services that you produce in a country. So if people cannot afford, those goods and services, the economy is not going to grow. So, basically, if a guard who's earning 35,000, if his son or daughter becomes a professional and starts earning 100,000, 150,000, he will be buying a motorbike, a TV, a refrigerator. That's where your economy grows. That's where the demand for the products and services come. This is exactly what's happening in India and Bangladesh. In Pakistan, only 1 out of 8 children are going to a university or degree college. In India, 1 out of 3 children are going to university or degree college. In Bangladesh, 1 out of 4 children are going to a university. So these people have invested. You know, if you go back 50 years, when China, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam started investing in education and healthcare and clean drinking water and flood protection, their situation was not very good. The per capita income was lower, much lower than, you know, obviously us.
Amjad sir,
But
I
they
need
did
to
sacrifice.
move back,
Am I out?
if you don't mind,
Okay, so.
because of the time constraint.
Yeah, sure.
So let me go back to Najy. You've talked about the human capital dimension. From the work of the Country Economic Memorandum and also your perspective on Morocco, we had King's Human Capital Initiative, which was a talk of internationally at that time. So if you could reflect a little bit on the human capital crisis, but also 2 other, very briefly. One is the domestic resource mobilization. We are caught in this trap, and there's been a lot of thought at the World Bank on raising own revenues, which is critical for sustainable development, and external vulnerabilities, which is the most immediate crisis we face. And within that context, productivity and export-based expansion, because we do need to move towards reserve build-up. Over to you.
Thank you, and I'll try to be quick, but the numbers you cited are tell it all. In my view, we've been speaking a lot about crisis, the reserves, the real crisis of Pakistan is the human capital crisis. I mean, these numbers are shocking, and just want to add 1 or 2. 40% of children under 5 are stunted. There's 20 million children that are under 15 that are out of school. So there's about 60 million children in Pakistan that are school age. A third of them are out of school. I won't expand on the numbers, but when you hear these numbers, we can speak about short-term growth. You don't get long-term growth with these levels of human capital. You do not forget about 7, 8%, 10%, 9%. You don't get long-term growth with these numbers. And I'll come to the revenues, because there's a number of myths. Everybody can say that, and we have these numbers, everybody agrees on these numbers, although they rarely make the headlines. I read the newspapers every day. It's always about, yes, rightly, about the reserves, the rupee, the deficit, etc. I've been here 2.5 years. I've never seen a headline of the English newspapers that I read, so maybe a small share, that speaks about the human capital crisis or that cites the 40% stunting number. This is just a nudge to our friend from Business Recorder, because I want some debates in the panel. But there's a bit of a myth. I'm hearing a lot, but we spent so much on education and we don't see the results. This is not true. I mean, the numbers you just cited, Pakistan is not, it's still a question of spending. And even if some can say, yes, but spending is inefficient and quality is not improving, that doesn't solve it. Pakistan is still not spending enough on education, on health, and on these topics. So I hear you. But for this, you need revenues. And yes, do I have something new to say on revenues generation? Does our Country Economic Memorandum have anything new to say? Honestly, not much. What needs to be done is known. Everybody says it. And the share of tax to GDP hasn't changed in 25 years. But I want to underline one point, at least, is to insist on the land tax, on property taxation, especially in cities. I mean, infrastructure in cities like Karachi, when you look at the wealth concentration, let's just take real estate of this city, that increasing property taxes on transactions, on the market value of the land, is a huge potential for a city like Karachi to solve its infrastructure issues. But it applies to all cities of the country. So I want to insist on this. This is a big one. The potential to increase land taxation and increase revenues at the local level, at local government level, is huge. There can be explanation of why it is not done, but that's a major one. And it has double benefits, not only the revenues, but to address the incentives issue. And that's my last point. On the exports and the dynamism, the country economic memorandum we launched last week, so it's online, mentions a number of things in terms of distortions that limit exports. One is the protection. I've already mentioned it. The tariff and non-tariff protection in many sectors of Pakistan has increased over the past 15 years, when it has decreased everywhere else. And it's not about being ideological. It is one of the countries that is most protected and that protects the domestic market. And that's a tax on exports. People don't people ignore the link between the two. They say, okay, we protect imports, it will mobilize domestic industry. What it means, and I don't want to go into the details of the numbers, it means that it's much more profitable to work on non-tradables and to work on your market rather than export. A 10% increase in tariff increases the margin for a domestic company working on domestic market by 40%. The calculus is easier. It's very easy. When you're protected, a country as big as Pakistan, why would you export? Why would you take the risk? And on top of that, when real estate is not taxed, why don't you put it all in real estate, which is what's happening? So protection, distortions in the taxation system away from productivity, increasing investments and exports, as well as other distortions, including subsidies, and that was already mentioned. And again, it's not about being ideological, and that's where Morocco, I think, did well, but East Asia as well, is to systematically, and you said it, to systematically ask the question on every single piece of subsidy that's significant, what are we getting out of it? And stop measuring subsidies in billions of rupees, measure them in schools that will not be constructed, number of health clinics that will not be constructed. When you start counting subsidies to the industrial sector this way, then it begs the question that you know what you're giving up. You're giving up on health clinics and schools. And then the question is, what are we getting of every single unbuilt school in terms of economic benefits by supporting certain sectors? Let me stop here.
Thank you. Ali, I've been reserving you for the most sensitive topic in this country today, but something which is on every businessman's mind. Whenever I am in a gathering, that's the first question that I am asked. But I'm not going to answer it. I may supplement you a little. But in your writing and articles, we do appreciate candidness and crispness of the analysis. And you have been writing on this topic that I'm going to touch upon, which is Pakistan's public debt sustainable? That's the first question. But let me pull two other questions so that you can answer in a comprehensive manner. What options Pakistan has for its external debt now? Obviously, I am taking the viewpoint that Pakistan's debt is unsustainable, which is contrary to the IMF lingual in its document that it is sustainable. I come from a school of thought that looks at the way these things are calculated. And we do know if IMF were to adopt its comprehensive surveillance yardsticks, Pakistan's debt will not be sustainable if you were to really look at the so many risks that Pakistan faces. So it's really in that context I'm saying what options Pakistan has for its external debt, which is going to further blow up if we don't arrest things. So we have two options, debt reprofiling or restructuring. And you look at it from the debt servicing yardsticks, and there are various measures, so I'm not going to go into the technicalities of it. You have recently also written that external, I have always said that, but one special thing that you have written is that we need to focus on external debt. But external debt alone will not steer us out of crisis. So how do we institute fiscal austerity and discipline, and how can we bring in the growing cash in circulation back in the system to create fiscal space? So if we are going to do debt reprofiling or restructuring, whatever your view is, then how do you go about creating both the external and the fiscal space so that it becomes more sustainable? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking this very pertinent and very sensitive question. That's in the mind of many people around, and the kind of situation we are living in, it's kind of become inevitable to do something with your debt. And with the reserve falling below $3 billion, the statement gross reserve, so the inevitability is right there in front of us, and that's going to happen pretty very soon. And so we need to talk about it. We need to think through about the options we have. So the first question you have is like about the debt sustainability. The first yardstick we see from its from a GDP perspective. In terms of the GDP, Pakistan total debt, that's in terms external and domestic debt both, that's about 75% or so of GDP. And we know that informality in the economy is very high. If you see from the yardstick of the currency in circulation versus M2, that's about 28%. And 28%, and historically it used to be 22%. And if you see around the neighbors around it, 10 to 12%. And if you see around the developed world, it's about 5-7%. So the informality is at least 1/3 of your economy and all that. So that makes your actual debt to GDP ratio even lower. That's about 60% or something. If you see the yardstick of this cash in circulation and all that. So that's one thing that in isolation, when the economic capacity of the country versus its debt, it's not that high. And now, that debt has two portions. One is the domestic debt and the external portion. So about 40% of your debt is external, and I'm talking about primarily public debt. That's mainly external. The private sector debt is limited, and then you have 60% domestic, and in terms of GDP, the foreign debt is about 30% or something. So these numbers are not out of proportion. And nowhere in the world you see any country with this kind of a yardstick from the GDP perspective is in a kind of situation where Pakistan is. So there's something more to it. That's about the yardstick of repayment capacity. So the repayment capacity in terms of your external debt is about, the gross financing requirement of the country for the next 4 years is about $35 billion each, and you're sitting at a reserve of $3 billion each. In that $35 billion, you assume a current account deficit of $10 to $12 billion each. Then you assume that your gross reserves move up from $3 billion to $17 billion in 2024 to $22 billion in some 2027. So when you see these numbers, if you cut down the current account deficit a bit by curtailing your consumption, which is the reality as of today, and live on the little reserves as of $3 billion, if you move up to $10 billion, not about $22 billion by 4 years, your requirement is reduced from, let's say, $36 billion to something like $22 billion, $21 billion each. And within it, $21 billion each, if there's about $12 billion each for the next 4 years is the short term, that's going to roll over every year. And within that, it's $13 billion. $13 billion is about 3.7 is the private sector. So the public debt is essentially about $10 billion or something. And then you have add on another public debt, that's short-term debt of $10 billion. If you solve it once, you're done for the next 4 years. Then there are 10, 11, 12 billion each for the next 4 years is the repayment on.
The gross financing requirements.
No, I'm cutting the gross finance.
Okay.
I've started from the gross financing requirement. Then I assumed that there were current account and the foreign exchange reserves the possibility. And I've just, by tightening the belt on the current account and reducing the level of the foreign exchange from what we agreed to the IMF in the last, staff review. So reducing the current account deficit from 10, 12 billion to 5 billion and reducing your, I would say this, the gross reserves from 17 to 22 billion the next 4 years to 10 billion at the end of each year. So by doing that, I'm cutting that number from 35 to 20. And that number is now, I'm talking about particular about debt. And within that 10 billion from the government side debt is short term, you have to solve it. Then you sort it out for the 4 years. Then you have 10 billion each for the next 4 years in terms of the amortization of your long-term debt, including your debt repayment, the servicing of the debt in terms of the interest payment. So 10 billion for the short term and 10 plus 10, 20 billion the next 2 years to 20, 25 billion. If we get that cushion for the next 2 years, you're good for the next 2 years. And once you're good for the next 2 years, you have ample time to create room for the another 2 years. And once you do that, you'll be steered out of the crisis. That's the primary thesis I have. Now look at the structure of your debt. That's about the external debt we are talking about. It's about $100 billion. For ease of the number is that it used to be $110 billion in September 22. As of the latest number, November 22, that's the latest number we have on the State Bank website. But since November to sitting in February, we have paid up some more debt because the reserves have gone down from 12 billion to 3 billion. And there's not much in the current account deficit. So primarily we pay down some of the debt. But still, if I take the metrics of the number, what we published, the latest number is November 22, it's about $97 billion, and out of that about $85 billion something is the public debt. And within it is about 30 odd billion is China, and then foreign exchange liability, if you include that, 10, 12 billion is from the GCC. So 30 plus 10, 40 around this, and then you 40 around is your multilateral. That's mainly ADB, World Bank, and then you have a 6, 7 billion of the IMF, and then you have 10, 12 billion of your private sector debt. So you cannot restructure your IMF debt. You can restructure your World Bank ADB debt, but it's something we should not go into this right now. We can live without it, and it's a very difficult thing to do. And so as long as you remain in the IMF program or you're committed to the reforms and all that, then your multilateral would give you more debt to pay the existing debt, and that's a long-term concession debt, so you'll sort out that thing as well. So the remaining is about, as long as an IMF, then the 40, 50 billion of about your bilateral and the commercial debt, which is again from China and mainly GCC countries, banks, where it is essentially the government has a say on it. So if we get again 20, 25 billion cushion from those friends for the next 5 years, that gives you in terms of debt, investment or something, that money to flow in, and to take care of your repayment for the next 2 years, as I did the math over there, you don't need any formal restructuring. You don't need any formal restructuring. You don't need any formal restructuring. I repeated 3 times. But if you don't do anything, then you'll be forced to a default as supposedly the IMF program, which the government is striving and everything, and all this taxes and price increase on the energy side and is happening, that is to get to the staff level agreement with the IMF, and then you unlock those gross financing needs from the friends as well, which again one of the condition of the IMF, so kind of loop as well. So let's not get into the details, but you're out. But for the next 3-4 months you get into the IMF program again. But if you don't pay it, you're getting into the default, and then you will be forced to restructure the debt. And when you'll be forced to restructure the debt, then it's going to be messy. You'll be hire consultant and all that. And when you go that route, they ask you to restructure your domestic debt as well. Now, that's the elephant in the room in my view. And that's a scary thought. If we talk about debt restructuring of the domestic debt, it's a very, very sensitive topic. Let me walk through a bit in that perspective. 60% of your debt is this, that amounts to, now we are talking about the domestic debt, so I'll talk in PKRs, it's about 33 trillion rupees. 33 trillion rupees, and out of that, 67% is your permanent debt, which is Pakistan Investment Boards, PIBs, and Ijara Sukuk from longevity of 3 years to 10 years. So that's, you have reprofiled your domestic debt, as in 2018, out of the 19 trillion or 16 trillion domestic debt we have in 2018, it was only about 25% was PIBs. So now we have offered those floating PIBs and all that. So we don't need to actually reprofile that. You're reprofiling that which is required in terms of your T-bills, which is about 6.5 trillion. It's 20% of your debt right now. So that's not a problem. Then you have NSS, the unfunded debt, we call it about 3 trillion, 2.5 trillion, all that. If you combine both them, that's about the 30%. So that's the key about it. So the key about it is that you don't need to reprofile the domestic debt, it's already profiled. The problem with the domestic debt is because the PIBs are floating, they're linked to the interest rate, which is 17% as of now, and the 1-year T-bill is trading at about 18.95 as of today, and as market is expecting another increase in the interest rate and all that, so let's assume your interest rate move up to 20%. And your 5.2 trillion rupees debt servicing, which out of which about good 70% or 80% is domestic debt, that go up to 6 trillion or something next year, and out of that about 4.5-5 trillion is domestic debt repayment, with the FBR target of 7.5 trillion and all that, and with the kind of 57% of that going, or effectively 60% of that going up back to the provinces, you are in deficit right from the day one, and for paying the government pension and military and every expense you're borrowing on that. So that's the thing. That's why people say you need to have a domestic debt restructuring. Okay, that's the problem you're talking about, because you're seeing just the expenditure side, but there is but you need to see that who is the holder of the debt. Out of that 33 trillion debt, you know, someone is holding that debt, and unlike the common perception, commercial banks are just intermediaries. Job is to take money from one and have a spread of it for operation and its profitability and all that, and then pass it on to the other entity who is requiring to borrow. In that case of Pakistan, that's primarily government of Pakistan. And so the commercial banks are intermediaries. The question are the eventual beneficiary of that. So out of that 33 trillion domestic debt, that's about 6.5 trillion of floating PIBs issued directly by the State Bank of Pakistan. Then there is another 6.6 trillion investment by the banks in government securities, where the liquidity is provided by the State Bank through open market operations in terms of the injection. 6.6 per 6.5 is 13 trillion, 13.1 trillion. That's 20% of your debt, 40% of your debt. So 40% of your debt is being held effectively by the State Bank of Pakistan. Who owns State Bank of Pakistan? Government of Pakistan. And 80% of that can flow back into the government. So irrespective of the interest rate, 15% or 30%, that 80% would get back to the government of Pakistan. So you have an interest expense of 5 trillion or 10 trillion, that majority of that from the State Bank comes to that. That's one thing. We clear on that? That's then another about 14 trillion is the depositors' money, where the banks are paying. So the depositor, there are two kinds of depositor money. One is that current account, where a checking account where banks doesn't pay you anything. But there is another saving account, or you have time liabilities that where the banks pay you. And here the banks are supposed to pay a minimum of 15.5% given the policy rate of 17%. That is 1.5% lower than, ma'am, you were the State Bank governor when this thing was imposed. So you know much better than me how this happened in 2008, I remember that. And now that's if rate move up to 20%, the bank would be paying 18.5% to those consumer. So that amounts to 14 trillion, out of which there are some Islamic banking deposit where the rate is effectively less. But for simplicity, we keep it at 18.5% at 20% interest rate, or 15.5% at a given interest rate of today at 17%. So, and the government, and on that 14 trillion, on that interest income, the government tax only 15%. If your interest income is less than 5 million rupees, that means if your deposit is less than 32 million, or if your deposit in the bank is less than 3 crore rupiah, then you're paying only 15% on this. I mean, that's an income, and that's a very hefty income. You're paying 15% on it, tax on it. Why not you tax it 40%? Why not you tax it at 50%? Why to tax the intermediation of bank higher? Why to tax the super taxes on those corporations and all that? Why to tax the individual who's earning 20-25 lakh a month and paying 35%, but the guy who's earning 25 lakh a month through saving and he's paying just 15%? That's not fair. That's not fair. So increase that, and if we increase that to 40%, you need another 500 billion or something. So that will solve a bit of your domestic debt problem, external debt problem. You need to solve in that way and move on that bad way. But you cannot do in isolation. A, you need to have an IMF program for multilaterals to move in. B, you need to have your friends, China and all that, because that's your main external debtor hard and confidence. And we've seen increasingly they need to have an IMF program and all that. But overall, what you need to have a resolve or economic reforms within the Pakistan, by the people of Pakistan, by the elite of the Pakistan. As yesterday Ori said that there's nothing wrong with elite capture as long as that elite objectives are aligned with the economic objectives of the country. Right now, just the sacred cow, the Maroof talk about is like the holy cow, the sacred cow about this on the real estate, and he explained beautifully. And then there are other areas, agriculture and all that. You don't tax on that. You bring a tax on that. You do the reforms, which is the right for the country, and they are aligned with the IMF. What IMF asks, what is the medium-term economic solution? That is, in a one simple word, bring down your fiscal deficit. Period.
Sure.
Period. Yeah.
Ali, with this, I'll have to move to the closure of this panel. I think we are running out of time, but we have 10 minutes. And I'd like each speaker to have 3 minutes to give their concluding thought. Ali has already given us his final word. Over to you, Najy.
Thank you very much. Maybe one concluding thought linking these, and thanks for the detailed expose. I was trying to take notes on the numbers. Yes, I was trying to take notes on the numbers, on the arguments on domestic debt. My closing point I want to make is to link this short-term question with the long-term, with the. For me, these questions of how to address these debt repayments and these debts in the short term, if it's to buy time and not do the needed in terms of the structural reforms, in terms of the openness, we go back to the core problem that brought us to these imbalances. Whether any decision on how to address the immediate needs is good or bad, for me what's most important is, are you addressing the structural issues that led us to this point? The rest is whether the next crisis will be in 2 years or in 8 years, if you don't move. I mean, go back to the 2000s. Pakistan has been in this situation before, and in situations where it received rents or support, it delayed the next moment where these structural imbalances reappeared because the structural issues that were behind them were not addressed. So these two topics, the short term and the long term, are linked, but the the short-term attention or how to address the imbalances today should not distract from addressing the core issues, because otherwise it's about, timing of the next crisis or the next moment where you're going to be facing the same issues. Is it 18 months or is it 8 years? And let me end at that. And it's both about the protection, the exports, the productivity and the incentives and distortions, as well as the revenue and expenditure framework, which needs fundamental change. Over.
Your last word.
Sure. My last words might be a bit longer last phrases maybe. But absolutely agree with a lot of things that have been said in the panel, particularly about, previous crises where our tendency has been to protect certain industries, who decides that, why is it good for the country, and looking at the imbalances, you have to earn in dollars to be able to, meet your payments on dollarized returns on energy and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of layers there. But let me give you an example on digital economy very quickly. One is that, when we talk about any sector or any reform, a lot of it, the first and foremost thing is about decision making, having competent people come in. Now, why I picked digital economy is, if you look at the previous two governments, one ministry actually did not change, from PTI to PDM, and that is Ministry of IT and Telecom. And, it's really why I think it's about decision making is that I think successive governments actually don't even understand the value of digital economy. Or maybe they think the IT is, wo computer wale dobara aa gaye. Right? Digital economy is fundamental to growth in the modern world, right? And human capital accumulation has to match up with it. But it is about decision making. I would even venture to say that there should be a Ministry of Data and Innovation in this country, right? But let me illustrate. I also want all the attendees to walk away with things that have been actually done, that have real results. So tying all the things that I've talked about, on property taxes, there's actually mapping technology that leverages mapping technology to understand what property taxes should be, how should they be assessed, how should they be calculated. But pairing that to monetary and non-monetary incentives of tax collectors. Really, and this is actually an example where 47% increase in tax revenue happened through those means. But also tying it back to the community. 35% of all taxes generated this way were used in Pakistan. I'm not talking about some alien country. 35% were used back into the community. Now, what that does is it repairs the social contract between a citizen and the state. Second example I'll give you is around we have a partnership with Precision Agriculture. We're providing crop advisory services for cotton, for wheat, livestock management. And this is not just small scale peanuts. We're talking about 1.3 million farmers reached through this advisory service. It's actually a two-way interactive voice response system where people can call in with their questions and an advisory can be sent to them every day. 1.3 million farmers. And then the last one where it's about using CFAN weather forecasting data and pairing that with the advisory. And that's going to about 194,000 farmers right now in Pakistan. So the fact of the matter is that you can actually use technology to solve real problems that increase productivity, that increase our capacity to produce more. And in that, it's a very simple intervention. It's really about an automated system that allows weather forecasting to pair with advisory. And one quick anecdotal thing on that is, of course the floods happen. Now that weather forecasting could not predict the scale and the magnitude of the floods, but it actually predicted very high precipitation. And these farmers in Shahdad Court and in Sindh and Punjab, some of them actually use that to harvest before the flood. And when you go back to these farmers, they realize, wow, I listened to this advisory and my livelihood and everything was saved. So these interventions are real, they have real impact, and they have impact not only the economy, but also smallholder farmers, their livelihood, their ability to earn more. Thank you.
Thank you. Amjad Saab and Ali, you'll have like 2 minutes each, if you don't mind. I'm getting messages to conclude.
Yeah, sure. So basically, we talked about structural reforms, we talked about agriculture reforms, we talked about the role of human development. I think one more aspect important is, state-owned enterprise, government getting out of business. I think it's very basic. State-owned enterprising are costing, in terms of subsidies and grants, they are costing about 1.2 trillion rupees per year, which is close to $5 billion per year. That's a lot of money. We simply need to quickly privatize all of these, and we need to do it quickly. I'll give you one example. OGDC, 2014, the government wanted to disinvest some of its shares in OGDC. So they got a price of $2.40. And the government said, no, that's less, we are not selling. Today, OGDC is trading at 35 cents. So I think there's a value to time. We need to move quickly in terms of privatization, and that includes selling state land, state-owned enterprises at the earliest, and using those proceeds to reduce our debt, which comes back to the key problem. One more point basically is I think we need to move governance from the federal and provincial level to the local level. Administrative and financial responsibilities should go to the local level. It's very important. That's where a person is close to a local councillor, but a common man does not have access to a secretary sitting in Islamabad or Karachi. We have not done it for 75 years. Others around us have done it and are benefiting from that. So we need to do that. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Ali, 2 minutes only.
I mean, I start from where I ended about that we need to reduce the fiscal deficit. And if we start reducing the fiscal deficit, everything will start falling in place in itself. How to do it? As the energy sector is one of the biggest, problem in Pakistan. And if we survive this debt restructuring and all that in the next few years, if we don't do anything in energy sector, that'll take this country out again. So we need to shift those the discos and all that distribution companies to the provinces. We need to shift their ATC losses over the permissible level to the provinces and to the third tier, and in that way that should be linked to the NFC award and all that. Then the land taxes and the agriculture taxes, which are part of the provincial domain, again these are to be linked to the NFC award, and we need to shift towards that. And then we need to see that in the past 20 years where we have increased the consumption, and that is being feeding to the current account because we cannot tax them fiscally. That's in the incomes from the real estate. That these are the incomes from the retail wholesale trade. Then if you see their economic path, they've really moved up that, and their share to tax and all that. When you start taxing them, these people would stop consuming. They will start consuming less, and that will address the current account problem as well. Then third thing is the remittances. We see remittances as a silver lining always. It has moved up from $1 billion in 2000 to $30 billion in 2021. And that remittances, we don't tax them, and that's all add to the consumption. So we need to do that. So we need to tax where there's tax knocked, and when we tax them, that the consumption would come down, that would address the current account problem, and that would feed up the fiscal side. And when we have the right structure of the economy, the entrepreneur and the private sector would like to earn the foreign exchange in terms of the export proceeds, be it the services or the goods, and FDI, again for efficiency seeking, not the market seeking. So first we need to understand, we need to deal with this debt, and we need to have this hard set. This country is going through an immense pain now. The inflation is unprecedented and it's going to be high. Do not waste this opportunity. Do not waste this pain to the common people and come to a resolve funds for all, where you have establishment, military, judiciary, bureaucracy, all the political parties sit down, the private sector sit down, and come and resolve the country and take the out of this mare of balance of payment crisis once for all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I have to thank all my panelists. I think the depth and the breadth of this discussion may not as yet match the depth and the breadth of the crisis, but we are in a multidimensional crisis, both domestic and global, and unraveling it is not going to be easy. Coming back to the future summit topic, which was to prepare for disruption, and there has been a lot of discussion on technology, new products, and so on and so forth. This panel was designed basically to reinforce the point that while you will have technology industry disrupt, but there will be limited gains unless and until you adopt economic reforms which are disruptive. Because if you do not change the tariff protection regime, and I'm just picking up one example that you had raised, you're not going to get industrial diversification. We need to move to exporting and exporting and exporting and consuming less and less. That is what our mutual experience, Najy and myself, but also of other researchers who has worldwide shown us. So we are advocating as a group disruption from economic reforms in a way that we move from supporting just the vested interest, providing subsidies or providing opportunities for rent seeking, to providing a level playing field, so that the industries or agriculture don't move on crutches, but are from day one sustainable. Lastly, the point that we covered, which is the debt restructuring or reprofiling. Pakistan is one of the highly debt-distressed economies we know. There are about 68, earlier the count was 73, but in the work that we are now doing internationally, at least at my level, with some of the experts, it's about 68 countries. The last deal that came from G20 was really the debt moratorium, which allowed Pakistan to be able to have a debt service suspension of close to 3.6 to 3.7 billion, in that range. And it was given in 3 installments. Where did that money go? Because that could have been saved in some form. Now, there is not going to be a deal like Common Framework, which happened just recently, but we are advocating that some more innovative policies have to be designed at the multilateral level, besides the fact that Pakistan needs to make an effort to restructure or reprofile its debt. But if we can really use, Najy, your good offices to make sure Pakistan is able to benefit from some of the innovative approaches to not just restructuring, but reprofiling. And just to conclude at my level, I don't think we can achieve an overnight result on any of these things, but perhaps people may not recognize on the debt side that actually debt restructuring is happening in a softer manner by tightening our belts. And people don't understand that that may not be debt restructuring, but we are already in debt restructuring. That's my point. We don't have to go and cry about it. We have to definitely make sure we tighten our belts so much that we ultimately don't enter a default. And that would be my last advice, that we should all work towards encouraging the government to have an independent debt management group and an independent debt management strategy that is forward-looking so that we prepare ourselves in a way that we don't have economic disruption at the end of the day. Thank you to the organizers, for our panelists.
Thank you so much. This was brilliant. Reprofiling was a key word here. Demonetization, land tax, property tax hike, external debt, tariff regime, such complex topics, pointing simply towards the need for maybe infrastructural clarity. What perplexes me that with such brilliant minds, I mean, they're right here, and we've seen so many more of them, such brilliant minds available nationally and globally, because digitization has sort of linked the world together. Why the problem persists is a bigger question for me. They say it's a problem when solutions are not available. But what do we say when the solutions are available and they're not being utilized? Is it lack of will? Is it lack of direction? We have the potential, we have the people, we have the guidebook. What stops Pakistan from solving the problems? Let's hope that our summit, as it is meant to get towards resolutions and solutions by bringing these brilliant people in front and making stakeholders aware of what we can do. Thank you so much, everyone. Here comes a token of appreciation, a nice book on the story of Indus as it rolls down from the Himalayas right down to the Arabian Sea. We'll begin with Najy Benhassine. Dr. Musaddiq Malik will be presenting the token of appreciation. Najy Benhassine. Maroof A. Syed. Maroof A. Syed. Dr. Amjad Waheed. Ali Khizar. Ali Khizar. And lastly, but not in the least, our very precious moderator, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar. Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, please. Thank you so much, everyone. And with that, we announce, yes, a group photo, please.